What if I told you that hidden within the deepest chambers of Christian mysticism lies a spiritual weapon so powerful, so devastatingly effective against the forces of darkness, that one of the greatest spiritual giants of the 20th century kept it secret from the masses? Tonight, as you sit there, perhaps wrestling with battles that seem impossible to win, struggling against invisible chains that bind your soul, or feeling overwhelmed by spiritual warfare that leaves you exhausted and defeated, you're about to discover the same technique that transformed ordinary believers into spiritual warriors capable of standing against principalities and powers. This isn't another feel-good message or surface-level teaching that promises much but delivers little. This is the raw, unfiltered spiritual technology that Watchman Nee himself wielded like a master swordsman, cutting through demonic strongholds with surgical precision. Picture this: a young Chinese believer, barely in his 20s, standing before seasoned missionaries and theological scholars, demonstrating a spiritual authority that left them speechless and trembling. Watchman Nee didn't just preach about victory over Satan, he lived it, breathed it, and manifested it with such undeniable power that even his enemies couldn't deny the supernatural force flowing through his life. But here's what will shock you: this wasn't some mystical gift reserved for the spiritually elite, or a technique requiring years of theological training. Instead, it was a simple yet profound understanding of spiritual mechanics that any believer could master, yet so few ever discovered, because Nee understood something that most Christians today have completely missed: the difference between fighting Satan and making him fight himself. The technique I'm about to reveal to you tonight was so closely guarded that Nee shared it only with his most trusted inner circle, those disciples who had proven themselves worthy of handling such explosive spiritual dynamite. While thousands flocked to hear his public teachings, only a handful ever learned this secret weapon that could dismantle demonic strategies in minutes rather than months. You see, most believers spend their entire lives swinging wildly at spiritual enemies, exhausting themselves in battles they were never meant to fight, completely unaware that there exists a way to engage the enemy that requires almost no energy while delivering maximum devastation to his kingdom. Tonight, that changes for you. But before I unveil this life-altering revelation, I need you to understand something crucial about the man who discovered it. Watchman Nee wasn't just another preacher or teacher. He was a spiritual scientist who approached the invisible realm with the same methodical precision that a physicist approaches quantum mechanics. Every spiritual principle he taught had been tested in the laboratory of real-life spiritual warfare, refined through years of persecution, imprisonment, and face-to-face encounters with demonic forces that would have destroyed lesser men. When he spoke about defeating Satan, he wasn't theorizing or repeating second-hand knowledge. He was sharing battle-tested intelligence gathered from the front lines of the most intense spiritual conflicts imaginable. What you're about to learn in the next few minutes will fundamentally shift how you understand spiritual authority, prayer, and your identity as a believer. This technique doesn't just give you victory over Satan, it positions you in such a way that his own attacks become the very mechanism of his defeat. Imagine turning every spiritual assault into ammunition for your advancement, every demonic strategy into a stepping stone for your spiritual growth, every moment of warfare into an opportunity for deeper intimacy with Christ. This isn't just about winning battles. This is about operating from such a high spiritual frequency that battles become unnecessary because the enemy recognizes a level of authority he cannot challenge. Are you ready to step into the same spiritual dimension that made Watchman Nee one of the most feared men in hell and one of the most beloved servants in heaven? The year was 1925, when a revelation so profound struck the heart of young Watchman Nee that it would forever alter the landscape of spiritual warfare for those privileged enough to receive it. But this wasn't a mystical vision that came in a dream or a supernatural encounter in some remote monastery. It was born from the most practical of all spiritual laboratories, suffering. As Nee found himself imprisoned by the very forces he was learning to defeat, he discovered that the greatest spiritual battles are not won through aggressive confrontation, but through a principle so counterintuitive that it defies every natural instinct we possess. The technique he uncovered operates on what he called the law of spiritual displacement, a principle that recognizes Satan's greatest weakness is not his lack of power, but his inability to occupy the same spiritual space as divine authority when that authority is properly positioned. Most believers approach spiritual warfare like amateur boxers entering a ring with a professional heavyweight champion, throwing wild punches and hoping something connects while absorbing devastating blows that leave them spiritually bruised and emotionally depleted. Nee observed this pattern repeatedly among sincere Christians who possessed genuine faith but lacked understanding of spiritual mechanics. They would pray harder, fast longer, and rebuke louder, yet find themselves trapped in cycles of temporary victory followed by crushing defeat. What they failed to grasp was that Satan is not defeated by our effort, but by our position, not by our strength, but by our understanding of where we stand in the spiritual hierarchy. The technique Nee developed doesn't require you to become stronger than the enemy. It requires you to recognize that you already occupy a position he cannot challenge when you understand the geography of the spiritual realm. This revolutionary approach emerged from Nee's deep study of what he termed the finished work of Christ, not merely as a theological concept, but as a present spiritual reality that most believers acknowledge intellectually while failing to experience practically. He discovered that every believer has been granted access to a spiritual position that is not earned through performance, but inherited through identity, not achieved through struggle, but received through revelation. The enemy's primary strategy, Nee realized, is not to overpower believers, but to keep them ignorant of their true spiritual location, fighting battles from ground level when they have been seated in heavenly places far above every principality and power. When a believer truly grasps their position in Christ, spiritual warfare transforms from exhausting combat to effortless administration of victory already won. The genius of Nee's technique lies in its simplicity and its foundation in what he called the principle of spiritual fact versus spiritual feeling. He taught his inner circle that Satan's greatest weapon is not temptation or accusation, but confusion about spiritual reality. The enemy works tirelessly to convince believers that their feelings, circumstances, and experiences define their spiritual condition rather than the unchanging facts of their position in Christ. Nee discovered that when a believer learns to stand on spiritual fact regardless of spiritual feeling, they create what he termed an atmosphere of divine inevitability, a spiritual environment where God's will manifests naturally because there is no resistance to divine flow. This isn't positive thinking or mental manipulation, it's the practical application of spiritual law that operates as consistently as gravity in the physical realm. But here's where Nee's teaching becomes truly revolutionary, and why he shared it with so few. This technique requires a level of spiritual maturity that goes beyond mere belief into what he called spiritual knowing. There's a vast difference between knowing about your position in Christ and knowing your position in Christ with the same certainty you know your own name. This knowing doesn't come through study alone, but through what Nee described as the breaking of the outer man, a process where the soul's dominance over the spirit is reversed, allowing the spirit to take its rightful place as the governing force in the believer's life. Only when this internal hierarchy is properly established can a believer operate from their true spiritual position rather than from the fluctuating emotions and circumstances that characterize soulish Christianity. The technique that Nee guarded so carefully operates on what he identified as the law of spiritual substitution, a principle that recognizes every spiritual attack as an opportunity for divine intervention when properly understood and applied. Most believers experience spiritual warfare as a series of random attacks that must be individually repelled through prayer, fasting, and spiritual discipline. Nee discovered something far more profound. Every demonic assault is actually an illegal attempt to occupy spiritual territory that already belongs to Christ. And when a believer understands how to invoke the proper spiritual authority, the enemy's own attack becomes the mechanism of his defeat. This isn't about fighting Satan, but about enforcing a victory that has already been legally established in the spiritual realm through Christ's finished work on the cross. The practical application of this principle requires understanding what Nee called the difference between soul power and spirit authority. Soul power operates through human effort, emotion, and will. It can achieve temporary results, but ultimately exhausts the believer and provides the enemy with opportunities for counterattack. Spirit authority, however, operates through recognition and declaration of spiritual fact, rather than through human striving. When a believer learns to distinguish between these two sources of spiritual activity, they discover that true authority flows not from what they do, but from who they are in Christ. Nee taught that the enemy has no defense against spirit authority because it operates from a realm he cannot access, the realm of divine fact established before the foundation of the world. This understanding revolutionizes how believers approach every aspect of spiritual life, from prayer to evangelism to daily decision-making. Instead of asking God to do something about their circumstances, they learn to recognize what God has already done and align themselves with spiritual reality rather than physical appearance. Nee discovered that when believers operate from this understanding, their prayers transform from petitions for divine intervention to declarations of divine fact. Their worship becomes an expression of spiritual reality rather than an attempt to create spiritual feeling, and their daily lives become demonstrations of kingdom authority rather than struggles for kingdom victory. The enemy cannot withstand this approach because it doesn't give him anything to fight against. It simply enforces a reality he is powerless to change. The most profound aspect of Nee's technique involves what he termed the principle of spiritual rest. This doesn't refer to physical relaxation or emotional peace, but to a deep spiritual confidence that comes from knowing the battle has already been won, and your role is not to achieve victory, but to enforce it. When believers grasp this principle, they discover that spiritual warfare becomes less about fighting and more about standing, less about overcoming and more about recognizing what has already been overcome. This rest is not passivity, but the most active form of faith, a dynamic trust that allows divine power to flow through human vessels without the interference of human effort or anxiety. But Nee understood that this level of spiritual operation requires what he called the renewal of the mind, not just changing thoughts, but transforming the entire framework through which believers interpret spiritual reality. The natural mind processes spiritual truth through the filter of physical experience, leading to conclusions that often contradict spiritual fact. Nee taught his disciples to develop what he termed spiritual thinking, a way of processing reality that begins with spiritual fact and interprets physical circumstances in light of spiritual truth rather than the reverse. This mental transformation is not achieved through intellectual study alone, but through the practical application of spiritual principles in real-life situations where faith must triumph over sight, truth must overcome feeling, and spirit must govern soul. What separated Watchman Nee's approach from conventional spiritual warfare teaching was his revolutionary understanding of what he called the geography of the spiritual realm. While most believers think of spiritual warfare as a battle between equal opposing forces, Nee discovered that the spiritual realm operates according to a strict hierarchy where position determines authority and authority determines outcome. The technique he developed doesn't involve fighting your way to a position of spiritual authority, but recognizing and occupying the position that has already been granted to every believer through their union with Christ. This isn't theoretical theology, but practical spirituality that produces measurable results in the believer's daily experience of victory over temptation, circumstances, and demonic interference. The key to understanding this positioning lies in what Nee termed the principle of spiritual identification. Every believer has been legally identified with Christ in his death, burial, resurrection, and ascension, not as a future hope, but as a present reality that forms the foundation of all spiritual authority. However, Nee observed that most Christians live below their spiritual inheritance because they fail to understand the practical implications of this identification. When a believer truly grasps that they died with Christ, they realize that the old nature Satan once controlled no longer exists. When they understand they were raised with Christ, they recognize they now operate from a realm of life the enemy cannot touch. When they comprehend they are seated with Christ in heavenly places, they discover they occupy a position of authority from which all spiritual warfare must be conducted. This positioning creates what Nee called an atmosphere of spiritual inevitability, a condition where God's will manifests naturally because there is no spiritual resistance to divine flow. The enemy's attacks become futile, not because they lack power, but because they are directed against a target that no longer exists in the realm where Satan operates. The believer who understands their position in Christ doesn't fight against demonic attacks. They simply maintain their spiritual position and watch as the enemy's own efforts result in his defeat. This is why Nee could face imprisonment, torture, and death with such supernatural peace. He wasn't hoping for divine intervention, but resting in divine fact that no earthly circumstance could alter his spiritual position or ultimate destiny. The practical application of this positioning requires what Nee described as the exercise of spiritual sight. Natural sight processes reality through physical senses and concludes that circumstances determine spiritual condition. Spiritual sight reverses this process, recognizing that spiritual position determines the ultimate outcome of all circumstances regardless of present appearances. When believers develop this spiritual vision, they discover they can maintain peace in chaos, joy in sorrow, and victory in apparent defeat, because their spiritual sight penetrates beyond physical appearance to spiritual reality. This isn't denial of physical circumstances, but recognition that spiritual facts ultimately govern physical outcomes when believers understand how to align themselves with spiritual law. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Nee's positioning technique involves what he called the principle of spiritual rest in the midst of spiritual warfare. This seems contradictory to natural thinking, which assumes that warfare requires effort, struggle, and aggressive action. Nee discovered that the highest form of spiritual warfare is actually a form of rest, not the rest of inactivity, but the rest of confidence, not the rest of retreat, but the rest of authority. When believers understand their position in Christ, they discover they can enforce spiritual victory without spiritual struggle, because they are not fighting for victory but from victory. The enemy cannot withstand this approach because it doesn't give him anything to fight against. It simply maintains a spiritual position he is powerless to challenge. The technique that Watchman Nee reserved for his most trusted disciples operates on a principle that completely inverts conventional understanding of spiritual conflict. the recognition that every apparent defeat contains the seeds of ultimate victory when viewed from the proper spiritual perspective. This isn't positive thinking or religious optimism, but a profound understanding of how God works through what Nee called the principle of spiritual alchemy, the divine ability to transform every negative circumstance into positive spiritual advancement when believers understand how to cooperate with divine process rather than resist divine purpose. The enemy's greatest attacks often become the very catalysts for the believer's greatest spiritual breakthroughs when this principle is properly understood and applied. Nee discovered this truth through his own experience of imprisonment and persecution, recognizing that Satan's attempts to destroy his ministry actually expanded his influence far beyond what would have been possible through conventional means. His letters from prison became some of the most powerful spiritual literature ever written. His suffering authenticated his message in ways that prosperity never could, and his apparent defeat became the foundation for spiritual victory that continues to impact believers decades after his physical death. This taught him that spiritual warfare is not about avoiding difficulty, but about understanding how God uses difficulty to accomplish purposes that transcend immediate circumstances. The believer who grasps this principle discovers that no weapon formed against them can ultimately prosper, because every attack becomes raw material for divine construction. This perspective transformation requires what Nee termed the development of eternal vision, the ability to see present circumstances in light of eternal purposes, rather than evaluating eternal purposes in light of present circumstances. Natural vision focuses on immediate outcomes and concludes that difficult circumstances indicate divine absence or spiritual failure. Eternal vision recognizes that God often works through apparent contradictions to accomplish purposes that could not be achieved through conventional means. When believers develop this vision, they discover they can maintain faith in the midst of confusion, hope in the midst of despair, and confidence in the midst of apparent defeat, because they understand that present circumstances are not the final word on spiritual reality. The practical application of this transformed perspective involves what Nee called the discipline of spiritual interpretation. This doesn't mean denying the reality of difficult circumstances, but interpreting those circumstances through the lens of spiritual purpose rather than natural appearance. Every trial becomes an opportunity for spiritual growth. Every attack becomes a platform for divine demonstration. Every apparent setback becomes a setup for spiritual advancement when believers understand how to cooperate with divine process rather than resist divine purpose. This interpretation is not achieved through mental gymnastics, but through the practical application of spiritual principles that have been tested in the laboratory of real-life experience. But the most profound aspect of this perspective transformation involves what Nee described as the mystery of spiritual timing. God's purposes often unfold according to a timeline that contradicts human expectations and natural logic. What appears to be divine delay may actually be divine preparation. What seems like divine silence may actually be divine strategy. What looks like divine absence may actually be divine positioning for greater demonstration of divine power. Nee taught his disciples to trust divine timing even when they couldn't understand divine purpose, recognizing that God's ways are higher than human ways and God's thoughts are higher than human thoughts. This trust is not blind faith but informed confidence based on understanding of divine character and divine consistency in working all things together for good, for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. The ultimate expression of Watchman Nee's secret technique involves what he called the mastery of spiritual reality, the ability to live consistently from spiritual fact rather than physical appearance, maintaining spiritual perspective regardless of natural circumstances. This mastery doesn't come through a single revelation, but through the consistent application of spiritual principles until they become as natural as breathing and as automatic as heartbeat. The believer who achieves this mastery discovers they can maintain spiritual equilibrium in any circumstance, because their stability is rooted not in changing externals, but in unchanging spiritual reality. This is the level of spiritual operation that made Nee such a formidable opponent to the forces of darkness and such a powerful instrument of divine purpose. This mastery requires what Nee termed the integration of spiritual understanding with practical living. Many believers compartmentalize their spiritual life, applying spiritual principles only in religious settings while reverting to natural thinking in daily circumstances. Nee discovered that true spiritual authority comes from the seamless integration of spiritual truth with practical application, where every decision, every response, and every action flows from spiritual understanding rather than natural reaction. When believers achieve this integration, their entire life becomes a demonstration of kingdom reality rather than a struggle between spiritual aspiration and natural limitation. The enemy cannot effectively attack this level of spiritual consistency because there are no gaps in spiritual armor, no inconsistencies in spiritual application. The development of this mastery involves what Nee called the cultivation of spiritual instinct, an intuitive understanding of spiritual dynamics that operates faster than conscious thought and more accurately than natural analysis. This instinct is not mystical intuition, but practical wisdom that comes from extensive experience in applying spiritual principles to real-life situations. The believer who develops this instinct can discern spiritual atmosphere, recognize spiritual attack, and respond with spiritual authority almost instantaneously, because their spirit has been trained to recognize and respond to spiritual reality. This is why Nee could maintain such supernatural peace and authority even in the most challenging circumstances. His spiritual instincts had been so thoroughly developed that his responses were automatic and accurate. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this spiritual mastery involves what Nee described as the phenomenon of spiritual multiplication. When believers operate consistently from spiritual reality, their influence extends far beyond their immediate circumstances and personal experience. Their spiritual authority creates an atmosphere that affects everyone around them. Their spiritual peace becomes contagious to those in their presence, and their spiritual victory inspires faith in others who witness the practical demonstration of kingdom principles. This multiplication is not achieved through human effort, but through spiritual consistency that allows divine power to flow through human vessels without the interference of human limitation or inconsistency. The ultimate goal of NEE'S technique is not personal spiritual success, but the advancement of God's kingdom through believers who understand and operate from spiritual reality rather than natural limitation. When believers master the principles he taught, they become instruments of divine purpose that can accomplish far more than their natural abilities would suggest possible. They discover they can influence circumstances through spiritual authority, impact others through spiritual atmosphere, and advance kingdom purposes through spiritual consistency. This is not about personal power, but about divine power flowing through human vessels that have been properly prepared and positioned to serve as conduits of heavenly reality in earthly circumstances. The enemy cannot withstand this level of spiritual operation because it represents the practical demonstration of Christ's victory over all the powers of darkness. Now you understand why Watchman Nee guarded this revelation as a sacred treasure, sharing it only with those whose hearts had been prepared to receive truths that transcend superficial religiosity and penetrate the deepest dimensions of spiritual reality. The technique you have just discovered carries within it the power to revolutionize not only your personal spiritual life, but to make you a catalyst for transformation in every environment you inhabit. When you truly assimilate these principles, you become a force of atmospheric change that affects not only your own circumstances, but the spiritual reality of everyone around you. What separates those who simply know this truth from those who live it is the courage to trust spiritual reality even when it contradicts physical appearance, transforming every moment of difficulty into an opportunity to demonstrate the authority that was always yours by divine right. The question that echoes through the centuries from Watchman Nee's lips to your heart in this moment is this: will you live as a spiritual beggar pleading for occasional victories, or will you assume your position as an heir of the kingdom, administering the authority that Christ has already conquered for you? If this revelation touched something deep in your soul, leave your like as a testimony, share this content with those who need to discover their true spiritual identity, and subscribe to continue exploring the deeper dimensions of Christian life that most will never discover. Together we will form a community of believers who not only know these truths, but live them with the same authenticity and power that characterized Watchman Nee's life.